recently joined members to be with us tonight. So if you're here for the first time, welcome, and hope that you enjoy the meeting tonight. If you don't, let somebody else know, or let me know. If you do enjoy it, let your friends know. That's the right way around, isn't it? Right. I noticed David had sent a quick email out this afternoon. I got a phone call from Radio Lancashire this morning. Would I be interviewed on the breakfast show in the morning about the gravity-fed ropeway at Clafton Brickworks? We had put a press release out regretting the demise of the ropeworks planned for 12 years' time, and they've picked up on it. So I've suddenly overnight going to become an expert on the Clafton Brickworks ropeway. So if you suffer from insomnia or don't like a lie-in in the morning, then at some stage, but I have not been told when I'm on. So hopefully I will be awake when the Radio Lancashire rings me to interview me. So that could be interesting. So, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for tonight, Dr. Bill Shannon. Bill's currently the treasurer and the vice president of the Cumberland and Westmorland Antiquarian and Archaeological Society. Get that on your letterheading. They're obviously antiquarian, as they're still calling themselves Cumberland and Westmorland. He's a trustee of the Cumbria County History Trust and the Morecambe Partnership, and he's a member of the committee of the Lancashire Archaeological Society. So that sounds like he's a busy fella. He's going to speak to us tonight about, well, his title is From Morikambe to Morecambe, How the Bay Got Its Name. So I know a lot of foreigners pronounce it Morikambe, and it would sound like they perhaps got it right purely by accident. So welcome, Bill, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, John. Shall I share my screen now, David?
You do what you like.
Okay.
The floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay. Can you see that?
That's fine. That's brilliant.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Right. First of all, I apologize to anybody who has already seen this talk, because I did this talk originally for the Morecambe Partnership right at the start of lockdown, when we started with doing what we call the Sunset series of talks, and they've proved very popular. They've been posted to YouTube, and this one has had an unbelievable 3,800 views. Whether it's the same person viewing it 3,800 times or 3,800 different people, I don't know, but I can't get over. I mean, I'm used to writing papers for journals where if 200 people read them, I think that's sort of quite good. So anyway,
strangely enough, Bill, if I can just say, yeah. My wife is incapacitated at the moment, and the other day I walked into the living room and she'd got this on the screen on YouTube. I said, "Good God, we've got that on Wednesday." So you're right. She's one. She may be the one.
She is that one. So I say I do apologise. I have tweaked it a little, partly because it was a little bit shorter than I'm going to do today, and I've added one or two bits and pieces. But okay, so let's kick off with Morikambe to Morecambe, how the bay got its name. This map that's behind you, some of you may recognize it from Father Thomas West's Antiquities of Furness, which was published in 1774. And you mightn't think there's much remarkable about that. There it says Morecambe. But the point is that this was the first time that any, what you might call modern map, any contemporary map, actually used that name. You can see that it's also got Leven Sands and Lancaster Sands and Cartmel Wharf. So these were the normal names for this area. So why did Father West put the words Morecambe Bay across his map like that? Now, this was actually in part an antiquarian work. It was about the Antiquities of Furness, and he went on, of course, to write tourist guides. His guide to the lakes is particularly famous. This map's a little bit perhaps difficult to interpret because north is off to the right, so you have to sort of tilt your head when looking at it. But you see here where he's showing the over sands crossings across the Lancaster Sands and across the Leven and Ulverston Sands, but he doesn't call the bay Morecambe Bay in this particular map, which was aimed more at the popular market, as you might say. And if you go back, this was the best single map that was available at the time, as opposed to a map in a book or something. This was Bowen's Large Atlas of 1752. And you can see there, it's marked as Cartmel Wharfs. No mention of Morecambe Bay there. And going back further, this was the first county map, Christopher Saxton's county map of Lancashire, 1577. And he's got Leven Sands and Kent Sands marked. Again, no hint of Morecambe Bay. So where did that name, Morecambe, come from? And to answer that, we have to go back to Claudius Ptolemy, who was around in the first half of the 2nd century. He was a mathematician, an astronomer, a geographer, and he came from Alexandria in Egypt, although he would have thought of himself as a Greek. He certainly spoke and wrote in Greek. The illustration, needless to say, is not contemporary. It's a 16th, 17th century illustration of the chap. He was much admired as an astronomer. Now, he wrote a book called The Geographia, which was basically, it wasn't a map, it was an instruction as to how to make a map. How to make a map of the whole of the inhabited world. He listed 8,000 places and he gave their coordinates in terms of latitude and longitude. He gave instructions on how to make a projection and how to make a single map of the whole world and 26 regional maps. Now, I hope I need hardly add that nobody in the ancient world thought that the world was flat. So the first thing he was trying to do was how to turn the globe of the earth into a flat map. Now, if you have a look at the diagram on the left here, you'll see perhaps that it extends round from 0 to 180. So that's half of the globe. Nobody lived in the back half of the globe. It was just ocean. And it goes from the equator here, south to the tropic, and north as far as about 60 degrees, the Arctic Circle, up towards the Arctic Circle. And again, nobody lived above that. So it was really focusing on that quarter of the earth that was occupied. And he, as he said, he explained it in a number of different projections for how to take the circle of the globe and turn it into a flat map. It was accompanied by a text written in Greek. No original copy survives, but it was lost in the West, but it became, it was preserved in the East, particularly through the Arab world. The Arab world, particularly interested in astronomy and geography, coordinates, how to work out where Mecca is relative to where you are. So the oldest manuscript survives is actually from the 13th century, and that's in Greek. And the oldest Latin translation survives from 1400. So, you're talking 1300 years after the event that are there. So there's all sorts of opportunities for errors creeping in the copying over time. And then we get a very early printed edition in the 1470s. On the left here, you can see this is a Latin translation, but the sort of thing that accompanies these lists of latitudes and longitudes. This explains about how to make the map of Europe, and it talks about Albion, the British island, and the town of London, which has its longest day of 17 hours long, and its distance from Alexander towards the west, 2 2/3 hours. So that's how you work out latitude and longitude. Latitude in terms of the longest day, from 12 hours at the equator, obviously, and its distance east or west from Alexandria, which was his base, 2 2/3 hours. Now, this is an example of an early printed world map. This is using a slightly different projection to the one I showed you before, but you can get an idea here of how the whole of the globe of the world, the quarter of the world that was occupied, how that was expressed in this map. And it was then accompanied by these 26 regional maps. Now, again, Ptolemy didn't leave us any maps. He left us the instructions for making the maps. And this one here, this shows Ptolemy's Egypt. So you can see the Nile, Thebes flowing up. And here, there's Alexandria. If you can see Alexandria there, there's Pharos, which is, the famous lighthouse and so on. So you can see the sort of detail that was included in these regional maps. And they extended from the island of Sri Lanka, Taprobana, at one extreme, to the other extreme of the known world, which of course was the British Isles, with the two islands of Albion and Hibernia. Now, you could say, oh, that's nothing like Britain, but of course it is. And the fact that Scotland has got tipped over through perhaps some misinterpretation of the numbers at some stage, and Ireland has got pushed too far to the north, but actually it's a pretty good representation of Britain, Wales, the southwest, Cornwall, etc., etc. It's a pretty good representation. Now, if we have a look at the northwest, we see here, and this is a Latin version, not a Greek version. Here it says Morikambe estuis, and it's somewhere in the northwest. Up here you've got Ituna estuis, and then down here you've got Cetea, and then down towards this area where the Ordovikis live. So this is North Wales. So all we can say is somewhere between the Eden and North Wales, there was this thing called Morikambe estuis in Latin. Now, if we look at the way it was actually presented, and this again is a Latin translation, a printed Latin translation, it's these lists of latitudes and longitudes, lists of places with their latitudes and longitudes. So if you come down here, we've got Ituna, then Morikambe, then Segantiorum, and then Belisama, Cetea, etc., running down with, on this side, their latitudes decreasing down from 60, 59, 58, 56, 54, etc. And the longitudes, again, moving west. These aren't quite the same. Somebody has, the person who, this chap Sylvanus who made this list, he's interpreted the longitudes differently to the ones actually Ptolemy wrote. Now, a few years back, I wrote a paper on this, and I was going back to transliterating the Greek words and then translating those Greek words and then showing the original Ptolemaic latitudes and longitudes, but turned into a method we would understand, which is degrees and minutes. So we've got, first of all, the Ituna Iskousis. Iskousis is the Greek word, and I've translated that here as tidal flats. Now, it tends to be translated as estuary, but the word estuary first comes into English in the middle of the 16th century. We didn't have a word for what we now think of as an estuary. That's a translation, that's a borrowing of a Latin word, which in turn was a borrowing of a Greek word. And that word, which I've translated here as tidal flats, actually means a rushing in. So it's the rushing in of Ituna, the rushing in of Morecambe, the rushing in of Belisama, and so on. I'll come perhaps to explain that in a little more detail in a moment. Now, remember, of course, there's no tides in the Mediterranean, or none worth talking about. So the idea of tides, the way we have them, the way we have 10-meter tides in Morecambe Bay, they were a total shock to the first Romans coming up in this sort of way. I know you know the story about Caesar on his first visit beaching boats along the south coast, and then by finding to his horror that they were all swamped when the tide came in. So tides of the sort that we've got here are quite a surprise. And I just, to show, I'm sure you're all familiar with this, but I took this little video in October, and I think you can understand why the Greeks call this a rushing in. Well, I hope you could hear that. I think the sound is part of the fun of it. I mean, I have to say, I love going to on site and watching the tide come in. And my granddaughter calls me a tidal bore, which I think is very funny. Anyway, but you can imagine how somebody from the Mediterranean, something like that was totally beyond their lived experience, and would have registered as something quite unique and something that is specifically British. Now, when Agricola pushed on the Roman invasion into the north, his son-in-law wrote his sort of story, Cornelius Tacitus, and he talks about Agricola choosing sites for camps and reconnoitering estuaries and forests. Now, I've translated that as estuaries, but the word is estuaria, and that's based upon the Latin word estus, which means boiling, seething. It's specifically relating to boiling water, that sort of thing. But the key point is that Tacitus is seeing Agricola reconnoitering estuaries as being a key feature of his conquest of the north of Britain. And a bit later, as he heads up towards Mons Gropius, the battle in Scotland, he addresses his troops and talks about the long road we have traveled, the forests we've threaded our way through, the estuaries we have crossed, all redound to our credit. So transisse estuaria. Again, these estuaries have registered with these guys. This is something very special in this the account of the conquest of the north, and it's the estuaries we've crossed. There's something to be crossed. They're the over sands routes that he's talking about here. Whoops, sorry, that just let's go back. Whoops. Okay, sorry, I was just if we look at these. In Ptolemy's account, these are the ischousis that he mentions for Britain. You can see particularly heavily down the west coast, but right the way up on both sides of the island from south to north. 6, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 of them. In the whole of the 8,000 places in Ptolemy's lists, there are only 14 ischousis. 13 of them in Britain and 1 in Spain. It's a very much a British phenomenon. It's something that virtually unique to Britain. Now, the Agricola campaigning up through the northwest in 79, this map shows him going up an inland route and then curving round and so on. But it strikes me that Agricola made it pretty clear that he crossed the estuaries. He crossed our estuary, Morecambe Bay, he crossed the Solway. This is part of what he's seeing as being the thing that he was so proud of, and which he thought redounded to the credit of his legions. Now, going back then to what we've got two things. We've got the name Morikambe, which is a British and a Welsh, if you like, word meaning a curve of the sea. In other words, a bay. So it's the Bay. And we've got this word Ischusage, which means a flooding in, a rushing in, which refers really to the tidal flats rather than the mouth of a river. There's a completely separate word for the mouth of a river. And we can see that here. So what we've got are a series of coordinates, latitudes and longitudes, dots on a map. Now, what the people trying to make maps from this were faced with is how do you join up those dots? I mean, how particularly down here, where from Setia Escluses down to Ganganon Akron, you've got this place in the between them, which actually seems to be following on. So the line would seem to come from there down to there and then back up to there before going down to there. But it's that you're making that up. Ptolemy isn't telling you that. But when the normal way of showing it these days is just to use straight lines with little blips to show places along the coast. So this is how it's shown in Rivett and Smith's place names of Rome and Britain. And here we've got Ituna, then Morikambe, Citantion, Belisama, Setia, and so on. And that blip is shown as the Llyn Peninsula turning back in on itself before going on down. So that's the information we've got to go on. So how do we reconstruct that? How do we decide what did Ptolemy, or not Ptolemy, of course, because he never came here, what were Ptolemy's sources thinking about? Now, William Camden, the great antiquary of the late 16th century, the map that he used in his 1600 edition of his book called the Britannia was quite clear where Morecambe was. It was up there. It was just, there's the Eden, there's where he's put Morecambe. And down here, he's got Citantion down to Belisama and so on and so forth. So that's where he thought it was. And that seems reasonable. And the Ordnance Survey to this day calls that bay, the bay of the Wampool and Waver, calls it Morikambe, spelt like that with an I. But that's not our Morecambe Bay. Now, Abraham Ortelius was a great map maker. He was based in Antwerp. He was the leading map maker, leading map publisher, let's put it that way, of his time. He didn't get out there in the field surveying. He used the best information he could get to produce the most up-to-date maps he could find. And one of the things he was obsessed with was the idea that history was the eye of geography, that the best way of understanding history was, sorry, I said that the wrong way around, geography is the eye of history. The best way of understanding history is to look at the maps. And so from 1579, he started publishing historical maps. His first one was of the Roman Empire that came out then. And then each year he was adding more historical maps. And by 1620s, he had produced 49 historical maps, and they were produced as a supplement called the Parergon, or Ancient Geography, in a number of tables. To his great atlas, the Theatrum Orbis Terrarum. And in 1590, he produced his map of Roman Britain in 2 sheets. It was later issued as a single sheet with north off to the right. But here you see, instead of putting Morecambe upward, Camden had put it. Now, Ortelius was regularly in correspondence with Camden, and I'm not saying they fell out of this over this, but they certainly disagreed. He's put it down here as either the Kent or the Leven, probably the Kent. And he's called it Morikambe fluvium, the river Morecambe. Okay. Now, us Brits would have none of this foreigner stuff. So, 100 years later, we were still producing maps like this Robert Morden's map of Britannia Romana, still showing the Morecambe estuary up there as the Waver and Wampool estuary. And it was left to John Horsley in the 1730s to state Morecambe estuary must be that in the northern part of Lancashire into which the rivers from Kendal and Ambleside empty themselves. Now, he didn't give any other reason. He just made an absolute blunt statement. It must be that one. And so his map marks Morecambe estuary, where we would put Morecambe Bay and the Atuna up there. St Antiquarian Portus, he's putting opposite the Ribble. Belisama, he's making as the Mersey, and Satir as the Dee. So, but this was a Roman map. This wasn't a map of modern Britain. This would have been known by academics and educated people, but it wasn't a sort of popular thing. Now, a little bit later, William Stukely, the famous antiquary, published the account of Richard of Cirencester with his ancient map of Roman Britain. Now, this had turned up in Denmark, of all places, a map of Roman Britain, which rather nicely shows the Eden, the Derwent, the Morecambe River, the Lune, the Ribble, the Dee. Now, this map allegedly was made in the 14th century by a monk called Richard of Cirencester, who'd copied a Roman original, and it had come down to us in that way. Now, it was later proven to be a forgery by a chap called Bertram, who was a very, very clever young man. He managed to fool the entire academic world, even though things like the fact that he calls this range of mountains the Pennine Montes should have been a giveaway. But for 200 years, this map was believed in. 100 years. It was believed to be the real thing. And this tended to enforce the idea that Morecambe was where we put it, not up there. John Whitaker, who wrote the History of Manchester in 1771, says, Richard, a native of Cirencester, monk of Westminster, author of many other historical, theological works, that the work is genuine needs no proof. All the embodied antiquarians of the 14th and 3 succeeding centuries could not have forged so learned a detail of Roman antiquities. Well, I'm afraid he was wrong. It was a forgery. But in a footnote, Whitaker says, thus the immediate succeeding estuary of Morecambe in Ptolemy, which means the Great Bend, must certainly be the large opening into the land of Lancashire, formed by the shores of Lancaster, Cartmel, Ulverston, and Walney Island, into which the rivers Ken and Lune discharge their waters, as this is the only Great Bend before we come to the estuary of Ituna, next mentioned by Ptolemy, which confessedly and clearly is the mouth of the Eden. So Whitaker was using, if you like, bad evidence, has come up with what we think of as the right answer. And when Father West came to write his Antiquities of Furness a couple of years later, he says, the Reverend Dr. Whitaker has cut the Gordian knot. Thus we have ascertained the Bay of Morecambe. And so he put that on his map, as we've seen. Fine. Now, the difference perhaps with Horsley's map was in a book. It was for academics. This similarly was in a book. It was for academics. But soon after, William Yeats made his, how many is it? 8-sheet map of Lancaster at the scale of 1 inch to the mile. Superb piece of mapping, sold as a separate item, and he marks the Bay of Morecambe. He still talks about Leven Sands, Cartmel Wharf, Lancaster Sands, but he's marked it as the Bay of Morecambe, and that sticks. Greenwood in 1818, Bay of Morecambe. Hennet in 1829, Bay of Morecambe. And then along comes the first edition of the Ordnance Survey, surveyed in the 1840s, Morecambe Bay. So, and of course, every map since then, from then to now, Morecambe Bay, and that becomes Holy Writ. Now, if you'd have asked me a few years back, how did Morecambe Bay get its name? I would have assumed it's the same as like Cardigan Bay is named after Cardigan. So Morecambe Bay is named after Morecambe. And in fact, it's the absolute reverse. Morecambe Bay is called that because some academics, some antiquaries back in the second half of the 18th century decided that that was what a 2nd century Greek astronomer had placed a local name derived, found by the Romans from the natives. So what about the town of Morecambe? Well, when the first edition Ordnance Survey is produced, of course, it doesn't exist. You've just got Poulton by Sands, but already people are starting to, if you like, cash in on the tourism aspect. So you've got the Morecambe refreshment rooms down here. You've got Morecambe Terrace. You've got the Morecambe Hotel clustering around Poulton. But the real important thing was this railway and that station, because in 1846, this railway company opened, the Morecambe Bay Harbour and Railway Company. And although it was initially predominantly a goods line, people began to come to Morecambe to take the waters, to spend time by the sea. And the area, the resort that grew up around the station, called itself Morecambe. And in 1889, that name was officially adopted. So by 1895, when this map comes out, Morecambe is a place. It's the official name, and you've got there, what's that say, Morecambe Harbour, and you've got lots of Morecambe names all the way around this huge development that's taken place in that 40, 50 years from the first edition. So Morecambe is named after the bay, and the bay, as I say, is named after where some 17th, 18th century antiquaries thought that they should place this name that had been written down in the 2nd century by a Greek astronomer based in Alexandria. Good. Now, I'm about halfway through. Let me just press on with a couple of other names that are also on Ptolemy's map that have given rise to an enormous amount of controversy over the years. And that is this one, Sitantion Limen. Now, if you put the Latin version of that, which is Porta Sitantiorum, into Google, you'll get a quite clear statement. It's a Romano-British seaport near Fleetwood. Okay, right. And in Rivet and Smith, which I referred to before, Sitantiorum Portus, Sitantion Limen, one of Ptolemy's descriptive names, probably a harbour at or near Fleetwood. Now, this is guesswork. What about evidence? Now, between the wars, I think in the 1920s, can't remember, a large sort of pebbly bank turned up off the Wyre estuary, and people said, oh, we found Sitantiorum, Porta Sitantiorum. But there was no evidence that this was man-made. It almost certainly wasn't. It's just one of those things that turn up. So there's absolutely no evidence for Sitantiorum Portus being in or around the Wyre. Now, Camden was the first one to try, William Camden, first one to try and identify it. And he reckoned that there'd been a mistranslation over the years, that the word was limna, meaning a mere, not limen, meaning a haven. And he thought that the Sitantion Limen actually referred to Windermere. And so on his map, he marks it as being basically the Leven running down here. So that we remember he'd put Morecambe up there, and now he puts the port of the Sitantiorum down here. Ortelius didn't agree. He located it at the mouth of the Lune, but he isn't specific as to exactly where he's putting it. I mean, is it the wire? The wire isn't shown as such. It's a bit difficult to see exactly where he's putting it. Horsley, he put it sort of vaguely off the Ribble. Here's the Ribble coming down here. So he's located it there rather than up at the wire. And how do we cut through this particular Gordian knot? Well, the first question I asked was just how many havens. We've seen how many Ischusits there were in Ptolemy's Britain. How many havens were there? Here's ours, Setantion Limen, the harbour of the Setantii. And there's the great harbour of the Solent, the Megas Limen, and there's the Kainos Limen, the new harbour at Dover. And there's one other, which is the Gulf of the Gabrantovices, which is described as being Limen. It's suitable for a harbour, not a current one. And that probably refers to Bridlington. So what we've got are 3 limen in the whole of Britain. And that sort of implies to me that they're pretty important places. This is the Megas Limen, the great harbour, which is Hengistbury Head and Christchurch Harbour. And if you look at sort of a map of the archaeology, it's absolutely teeming with archaeology. This whole area here is absolutely full of Iron Age pre-Roman material. So although it was used by the Romans, it had been an important harbour, an important landing place, an importing place before the Romans reached these islands. So we've got the New Haven at Dover. That was established by the Romans, and it becomes the main base for the Classis Britannica, the Roman fleet. We've then got the Great Haven, which was important in the pre-Roman Iron Age, although the Classis Britannica also had a major base at Portchester. But the key point, and the important point, is that Hengistbury Head was this international trading site, trading with the Mediterranean, exporting metals and salt, importing wine and other luxury goods. And I think Setantion Limen must have been equivalent. It must have been an important pre-Roman Iron Age depot, trading with the Mediterranean, although perhaps on a smaller scale than the Great Haven. And if that's the case, then we'd expect to find archaeology like we do at the Solent. So where in the Northwest do we find pre-Roman archaeology evidence for importing and exporting for a major trading point? And the answer we've known since 1863, when a large number of Carthaginian coins, Gaulish coins, Roman coins, the sort of stuff that you would expect to find in the sort of place that I think the Setantion Limen must have been. Now, it would seem that it was pre-Roman Iron Age. It went on through the Roman period. Sorry, I'm talking about the ancient Mells on the Wirral coast. I'll show you that in a second. It went on to be a major trading post throughout the Roman and post-Roman period. And as it says there are more of some types of Viking finds coming from Mells than come from York. It's a hugely important site for hundreds of years. Here's some of the Roman fibula from the site. There's a superb book on the subject by Rob Philpott and others. The site that we're talking about is Mells, which is from the Old Norse word for sand dunes. And it doesn't look too prepossessing on the modern map, but on an older map, the key point is Hoylake. Here you've got this deep water, sheltered place where you could drop your anchor and haul up between the Hoyle Sands and the mainland. So you can imagine here the ships coming into here, perhaps beaching along here, or perhaps sending small boats to beach along this coast where there was this trading port. Here's a conjectural reconstruction of it. So you can see the boats sort of being hauled ashore here and the trading post just back of the sand dunes there, and the sheltering in the Hoyle Lake behind the sand dunes. Now, the name Setantiorum Portus, Setantion Limen, means it's the port, the haven of the Setantii. So who were they? Now, Rive and Smith, they say they're named after a Gaulish wayfarer goddess, a goddess of travelers, but the name is also clearly related to the river Satia, which they identify with the Mersey. Now, so my hypothesis is the Setanti were a relatively small tribe. They occupied the Wirral. They control that beach market from about the 5th century BC. They exported salt from Cheshire, maybe metal from North Wales, and they imported luxury goods from the Mediterranean. Now, the other thing just to mention in passing is we've talked about the coast, but the map also shows the names of tribes and other people inland from those coasts. And here we have the Brigantes, okay, who are the tribe that occupied the north across from coast to coast, basically. And it may be that the Setanti were a sub-tribe of those Brigantes. But the interesting thing is there are Brigantes in Ireland as well, according to Ptolemy. You can see there, we've got Brigantes here and we've got Brigantes there. And the suggestion of communication backwards and forwards across the Irish Sea between these two groups. And maybe there's a hint of this in the Irish hero Cuchulainn. Now, Cuchulainn, he gets that name as an adult hero, but his birth name was Setanta, or more specifically, if you're pronouncing it in Irish, I believe it's Shedanda. But Setanta seems to me to be clearly related to the Setanti. And if you look at the life of Cuchulainn, he's in his youth, he spends time on the eastern side of the Irish Sea in Albion, where he stays for a number of years with a relation. So there's this move backwards and forwards, the Setanti, perhaps the Brigantes on both sides, and this major port, the haven of the Setanti, linking them. Now, we've then got a small problem that on Ptolemy's map, we've got the haven of the Setanti up there, but the river, the Ischousis, the estuary of the Satia, down here. So how do you reconcile that? And it seems to me that Ptolemy has been looking at two different sources. The first one is a pre-Roman merchant source. Basically, how do you get up to this important haven, this important port? And the key points are listed: rivermouth, promontory, rivermouth, 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 promontory, and round to the haven. When Agricola orders the circumnavigation of Britain in 84 AD after the battle, there's a different agenda. They come round anti-clockwise from the northeast of Scotland, and they're noting the tidal flats, tidal flats, tidal flats, tidal flats, tidal flats, as they come around the coast. So you've got perhaps two different competing evidences, both ending up at the same place, but Ptolemy getting it slightly wrong in attempting to interpret these two different sources. And then, of course, there's a third source, which is the inland data. Now, that definitely comes from a different source. Again, it's predominantly a Roman military source, perhaps different for the south than from the north. But some of the evidence in this interior source are very inaccurate. This one, Vinovium, here is now Binchester, which is right over in the northeast. And you can see he's got it almost on the northwest coast. And you can see some of the other places. There's York down there, Olicana, which may be Ilkney, Cataractonum there, Calargon, which is usually thought of as the fort at Overborough, which is sort of more over this side. So, he's got a lot of the place names, but they're all a bit mixed up. They're a bit confused. And this is to do with copying errors over the years. It only takes one number to be misread, a longitude to be misread, and you place it there instead of over there where it probably should be, and so on. Before I leave this, there's just one other place, which is Rigodunon, which has a lot of ink has been spilt over trying to identify where that is. I'm sure you'll have heard that people say it's Lancaster amongst many other places. You name it in the northwest, it's been identified as Rigodun at some time or other. My own preference is probably for Kirkham, but I'm not going to go I'm not going to fight to the death over that. If you'd like to read any more about this, I did write it up a few years back. It's available in the Cumberland and Westmorland transactions, or if anybody wanted, I'm sure David will let you have my email and I'll send you a PDF of it. Now, before I finish, I'm going to have to rush a bit. Just a bit about crossing the sands. That was so important to Agricola that we saw that he mentions it, or it's mentioned twice in those accounts as something that's really crucial. So let's just have a quick look at crossing the sands. That's Lancaster Sands, David Cox, wonderful painting. If you go up near Cartmel, you'll see this rather fine milestone from Cartmel saying 15 miles to Lancaster, 7 miles to Ulverston, over sands. Now, this is in the Maritime Museum, wonderful illustration of the coach road rushing across. That's Chapel Island there. It says Lancaster Sands. This is in fact the Leven Sands. If you put Lancaster to Cartmel into the AA route planner, it tells you that it's 30 miles. Now, this milestone says it's 15 miles. And if you do the same thing with Cartmel to Ulverston, that says it's 16 miles, and this milestone says it's 7 miles. So, the reason why you cross the sands is to get from Lancaster to Ulverston would take 2 days if you went keeping your feet dry the whole way. It would take under a day if you went by the over sands routes. And that's why these over sands routes were so important, whether you were an invading army or somebody going to market or whatever. Now, how far back these roads go, I don't know. They're not paved roads. It's difficult to say. But this is a 12th century, the foundation charter from Conishead Priory. And it says, it's describing the boundaries. They say, beginning at the bank of the sea where the royal road emerges from the sands of Leven. So in the 12th century, regalis via, it's recognized as a royal road, a king's highway. Even though it's not paved, it's just a route across the sands, but it's a royal road. It's the king's highway coming across the sands. And the question is, to what extent did the Romans utilize these oversands routes during the rest of the time of Roman Britain? Now, Thomson Watkin, writing in the late 19th century, he was absolutely clear. There were Roman roads running across both the Cartmel Peninsula and the Furness Peninsula, and he gives a lot of evidence where the Roman road is visible, and using place names and street gate. That's an obvious sign of a Roman road. And more recently, Dan Aylesworth has published a paper in 2007 on the evidence for the Roman use of these oversands routes. Now, some of you may know David Ratledge. You may even have heard him speak. I don't know. He's done a lot of work using LiDAR, which is this sort of radar-based looking at indentations and ripples in the landscape. It's a superb way. And David has found an enormous number of new Roman roads, new routes for Roman roads using this technique. So I asked him some time ago if he could find me a Roman road across the Cartmel Peninsula. This is the modern road, which runs into Fflewdburgh and then up to Cark, but the over sands route ran through Fflewdburgh down to Sandgate and across past Chapel Island to Ulverston. Now, I believe the Roman road actually took this line here, this southern line, and went up to Sandgate that way. But there is a problem in that there's absolutely no sign of anything on the LiDAR between those 2 points. Now, why that is, I've no idea. David Ratledge has drawn these putative Roman roads, places that he's looking for the Roman roads, not where he's found them. And he tends to think it's slightly to the north of my line. And the reason that he's saying this is he he is looking at these old sea banks. Here's my line down here. Here's his line up here. And he thinks that these were sea banks, medieval sea banks, and that before that, you know, the road would have been to the north of that. But I don't know. If you look on the geology maps, they're marked as raised storm beach deposits. So I think those ripples in the landscape are natural, not artificial. So, but it's still, shall we say, it's an open question. And I'm just going to finish now with just a quick word about the Roman fort that has been discovered relatively recently at Burscough in Lancashire. Now, Burscough has long been known as the first element. Bur, B-U-R-G-H, usually means a fortified place. And the second word, skoga, is a Viking Norse word meaning woodland. So does it mean the fort in the wood? Well, those who've been looking for the Roman fort there for some time think it does. And a couple of years back, through using ground penetrating radar and that sort of thing, they found it and they've done a couple of seasons of digging and are absolutely clear there was a Roman fort there. Now, if there was a Roman fort there, then it would have had a nice connection with Kirkham, which lies almost due north, and the road would have run up to Hesketh Bank and then would have forded the Ribble. And I think it is worth remembering that we are not the only one who's got over Sands crossings in Morecambe Bay. We've certainly got them up at the Solway. And as Yates's map shows here, showing from Hesketh Bank to Guide's House, Freckleton onto Kirkham, was fordable at low water. So did the Romans, was this yet another of those estuaries that Agricola was so proud of having crossed? And I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much. Good. So if anybody's got any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Leaving you all dumbstruck, that's fine.
Right. That's a lot to take in. You couldn't have started any earlier in history because they couldn't write then. Questions? Can you stick your hand?
I can see Elizabeth has a hand up if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Right. Elizabeth, would you like to lead off?
I just wondered if Ptolemy had actually chosen the name Morecambe from the people who already lived there, and if so, how he knew that.
Yeah, I mean, I should have gone into this. Yeah, when those Roman soldiers in this part of the world are either coming up through in 79 or coming back down in 84, what they're clearly doing is collecting the local names of places. So they're quite literally asking people, what's that place called? And so all of those names in Ptolemy are local British, Brittonic, primitive Welsh words. And perhaps unusually, the word Morecambe is so transparent. It means the Great Bend. It's, it really is a much more transparent than some of the other names. But yeah, quite clearly, Agricola's people picked it up from the locals. Somehow or other, between 84 and 150, the information that had gone back to Rome passed into the hands of Ptolemy, who was an inveterate collector of data. So he's got it. So he's got it from somewhere in Rome. They've got it from Agricola. Agricola got it from the natives. Yeah.
JMR.
Yeah.
Thank you. What about marine archaeology in this? Does that play any part in reinforcing thoughts?
Well, I'm not aware of anything that any light that can be thrown on by any marine archaeology that's taken place, but I'm not aware of that much that's taken place in this part of the world. I mean, part of the thing is that we've got these very high these very high tides, the 10-meter tides. We've also got, of course, the constant changing of the one year you've got a salt marsh here, and then it gets wiped away and another salt marsh appears over there. So whilst we've got a certain amount of coastal archaeology, it tends to be medieval stuff. The reappearance of fish traps and that sort of thing around our coast. But who knows? The next high tide may reveal some Roman work. But certainly, I mean, down there on the at Mells, it's not stuff that stuff has from time to time got washed up from the what was the Hoyle Lake, but most of the archaeology was in the sand dunes. Yeah.
I was born in Mells and
oh really?
spent many days in the sand dunes.
Okay. Did you ever find a fibula?
I did. Thank you.
Sounds like you should go back and do some digging. Roger, you're muted.
Yeah, Prince Philip went across the sands in a coach and four.
He did.
And you showed a lovely picture of horses dashing through the water. And obviously you could only do it at low tide. But what evidence is there for the frequency of crossing? You said, I mean, obviously it's a very important one. It saves you an awful lot of time and mileage. But would they be once a week or once a month?
No, twice a day. Twice a day.
At low tide?
Yeah. Well, it doesn't have to be at low tide. Roughly from 2 hours after high tide till 2 hours before the next high tide, you can cross. Okay, so that's your window. So you've got a sort of a couple of hour window twice a day where you can cross. Now, in the 12th, 13th century, the two main monasteries, as an act of charity, set up guides. So not Cockersan. Oh dear God. Well, no, not Furness actually. Sorry. Anyway, the two monasteries. Sorry, I'm having a brain fade here. They employ guides, and then of course at the time of the dissolution, the crown takes on those guides, and they become the Queen's Guide. And
that's when Cedric Robinson started, was it?
Sorry.
That's when Cedric Robinson started.
Well, not quite as far as the dissolution, but almost, yeah. And it's great. I've gone across a few times with Cedric myself. He, of course, famously accompanied Prince Philip on that famous journey. But so for years and years and years, the guides would be there, and you would contact. You would turn up at Carter's house, guide's house, or whatever, and hire them to take you across. Each morning, well, whenever they would go out and they'd put the brobs, to mark the path on the off chance. Now, at certain times, say at times of hiring fairs, a lot of people would be crossing. People would go across to market and that sort of thing. But then, once the sort of the coach era comes, then it becomes a sort of a regular thing. I mean, again, if you go into the Lancaster Maritime Museum, you'll see posters in there advertising the times of the coaches going across from Ulverston to Lancaster, and they're running a scheduled. Of course, the time that you set out varies each day according as the tide changes, but it is a scheduled service. It's going across. Presumably, if the weather was really bad, then they would abandon it. But I mean, some of those. There's a superb steel engraving by Turner, showing driving rain, really dreadful conditions that he must have encountered, and showing the excitement of going across. And of course, it then becomes a tourist attraction. It becomes a thing that people want to experience, not because they have to, because they're going to work, but because it's something they want to write about. It's as exciting as climbing a mountain or going down a mine, Yeah.
It always seemed to me a great picture.
I'm not sure how well you can see this, but this is actually a copy of Turner's print.
Ah, excellent. Thank you. Yes,
it's that's not very the one because the camera's rubbish, but
that is the one I'm talking about. So you can vouch for the dreadful weather that
I know it's lovely, but anyway, there you go.
Yes.
Thank you, Patrick.
I've always thought it was a great pity that we never sort of continued the across the sands thing, apart from Cedric, but by boat. I think the Victorians had a boat which went from Morecambe to Grange to Barrow, and then
the boat actually went from Fleetwood to Bardsey, just south of Ulverston. So you could sail right the way across to Bardsey. There was a pier there. It was a steamer that ran across. But of course, like in the same way as the over sands routes, the coach roads, both of those were knocked out of existence by the railway. The coming of the railway, all of a sudden, it's so much more convenient to go across the Arnside Viaduct by train than it is to go in the conditions that Turner showed.
Right.
Would the
Are
coach
there any
wheels?
other questions?
Would the coach wheels have to be of a special kind of wood to withstand the salt and the sand?
Well, they don't. I would have thought that it would make more sense for them to be wider and all that, but they just appear to be the ordinary
normal
coach. Yeah. Now, how long they lasted, I don't know. Yes. Yeah.
Keep somebody in work.
I wouldn't fancy going over in a 20-year-old coach. Yeah.
Are there any other questions?
Bit like
Roger Dillon.
Yes, hello.
Hi.
I was just reflecting on the fact that the town of Morecambe grew up in the 19th century around the village of Poulton, Les Sands.
Yeah.
I wondered if there was any ill feeling from the people of Poulton that the whole place was not named Poulton.
That's very interesting, and I've not looked at it, but it's the fact that Poulton's sort of over there, and this railway station is over here, and it's the houses that get built around the railway station that call themselves Morecambe. And of course, that spreads and spreads until it overwhelms Poulton. And then the city fathers, whoever they were, decided to officially call it Morecambe instead of just being that, the sort of the local name. Now, what the people who lived in Poulton for generations thought about that, I can only guess at. Incidentally, William Camden, the historian, the 16th century historian, I seem to remember his mother came from Poulton. So he had a Lancashire connection. Yeah.
So did Eric Morecambe.
He did indeed. Yes. Yes. It's a moot point. Which of those is the more famous? Yeah.
We'll not go there. Are there any other questions? No? I have 2 pages of you on my screen, so I have to go searching. But I think we've got you all in view. Well, personally, I found that fascinating. I've always been interested in the local history, and to see Morecambe existing actually before Lancaster was named. Means I'm going to have to shut up now when I'm in with friends who come from Morecambe. But I'm thinking of one in particular who won't be seen dead in Lancaster, a true sandgrounder. So yes, that was excellent, and I'd like to thank you, Bill, for that. And if we'd like to unmute everyone and show our appreciation in the normal manner.
Brilliant, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you. I shall I leave now? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Gordon has got. Is that a thumbs up appreciation, Gordon? You.
Yeah, I think so.
Amy, you had a hand. Was that?
I think she was waving. And Mandy did.
Is that a wave? All right.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
It's an applause, John.
Okay.
It's an applause, is it? All right. You're not moving. Have you frozen? Have you is your central heating gone? No.
She's very sensibly not got her video on.
No.
And I'm leaving at this point. Good to meet you all.
Right. Well, again, thank you, Bill. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Good night. Right. If anyone, what time is it? 25 to 9. Anyone want to say anything? Here's your opportunity before we pull the plug. No.
Of course, you know what's happening at 9 o'clock, don't you? The next series of The Bay is on
The Bay.
ITV.
Right?
The third
I would hate
series.
to keep you away from that. I'm told that the first 10 minutes are the most important of this first episode. So
I have to say, when we arranged this, we didn't know that was going to be coincide with this evening.
yeah, and I don't think the program planners knew what we were doing. We've had some good numbers tonight, so I'd like to thank you all for attending. Trust you enjoyed it, and what's the title for February, David?
We have Kieran Keane, the Chief Executive of Lancaster City Council, who is retiring, and he's coming to give us his thoughts on what it's like to be a Chief Executive of a city council like Lancaster, which I'm sure it'd be a good opportunity to have a few questions for him.
Yeah, but is he speaking before? Is he speaking before or after he's sorted his pension?
I think he will have. He sorted his pension, and I think he'll be D-mob happy. So, get in.
I can't believe there'll be any secrets revealed. But, anyway,
There might be.
We'll look forward to that. So, thank you all very much, and good night.